On November 24th, 1221, according to multiple independent chronicles, including Persian, Mongol, and even Georgian sources, Genghis Khan, the man who had just destroyed half the known world, did something he had never done before. He ordered his archers to stop shooting at a fleeing enemy. That enemy was a 22-year-old Sultan who had just watched his entire army die, spurring his horse off a 20-foot cliff into the freezing Indus River. The conqueror of empires struck his hand to his mouth in astonishment and told his sons, "Such a son should a father have." Think about those numbers. Contemporary chronicles, Juvaini, Nasawi, Rashid al-Din, all document that by this point, the Mongol war machine had slaughtered its way through an empire of 5 million people in less than 2 years. Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, cities that had stood for 1,000 years, reduced to rubble. Yet here stood one man who had already beaten them once. The young Sultan Jalal al-Din had assembled a coalition of 60 to 70,000 warriors at Ghazni and achieved what no one thought possible. He had shattered a 30,000-strong Mongol army at the Battle of Parwan just 2 months earlier. That victory triggered rebellions across the conquered territories. It made Genghis Khan furious enough to pursue this sultan personally. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented historical sources reveal the moment when individual courage collided with history's most efficient killing machine, and why even the victors remembered it with something close to reverence. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that historians still debate. First, the tactical maneuver recorded in contemporary accounts that won the battle, scaling a mountain the defenders thought was impassable. Second, why a dispute over a single white horse destroyed a coalition and changed the fate of Central Asia. Third, the exchange between grandfather and grandson that Mongol chroniclers themselves preserved. Words spoken on a battlefield that echo 800 years later. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did a 22-year-old commander with a decimated army, trapped against a river with no retreat possible, nearly break through to Genghis Khan himself? What tactical decision, recorded by his secretary Nasawi, who was there, allowed him to drive back the Mongol left wing despite overwhelming odds? Why did Genghis Khan, who had ordered the execution of entire cities, who had made pyramid after pyramid of severed heads, forbid his men to kill this particular enemy? And most puzzling, how does a battle that ended in total defeat create a legend that even the victors celebrated? To understand how the impossible became inevitable, we need to step back to 1219, when the Mongol storm first reached the gates of the greatest Islamic empire you've never heard of. By 1219, Shah Muhammad II controlled an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. 5 million souls, a 1,000-year-old urban civilization, armies that had crushed the Seljuks and humbled the Abbasid Caliphate, the Khwarezmian Empire, as historians call it now, controlled what we know today as Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Gurganj, Merv, Nishapur, were centers of learning and trade that had flourished for centuries. On paper, this empire should have been unconquerable. But empires aren't built on paper. They're built on loyalty, administration, and unity. The Khwarezmian Empire had none of these. Shah Muhammad II had expanded rapidly in the early 1200s, replacing the Seljuk hegemony and swallowing the remnants of smaller dynasties. According to the Persian chronicler Juvaini, who would later document the empire's fall, this rapid expansion created an administrative nightmare. The empire was a patchwork of recently conquered territories, each with its own power structure, each barely loyal to the center. Think of it as a house built too fast on unstable ground. It looked impressive, but the foundation was crumbling. At the heart of this instability was a power struggle that would prove fatal. Shah Muhammad II's mother, Terken Khatun, was a Kipchak princess who commanded the loyalty of the powerful Kankali Turkic tribes. Contemporary sources describe the relationship between mother and son as what one historian termed underscore, quote underscore one underscore underscore, two rulers in constant tension. She wielded substantial power in the realm, enough to challenge her son's authority, enough to create a fatal division in the military aristocracy. The empire was fractured along ethnic lines. Persian administrators ran the cities and managed trade. Turkic military aristocrats commanded the armies and controlled the steppes. These groups distrusted each other. They competed for power. And Shah Muhammad II, caught between his Persian subjects and his Turkic military base, trusted almost no one. Almost no one. He did trust his eldest son, Jalal al-Din. But here's where the dynasty's weakness becomes personal tragedy. Jalal al-Din's mother was Aychichek, a Turkmen concubine. In the complex hierarchy of medieval Islamic courts, this meant everything. The son of a concubine carried lower status than sons born to wives of noble families. Terken Khatun, the queen mother, favored Jalal al-Din's half-brother Uzlag Shah, whose mother was also a Kipchak like herself. She refused to support Jalal al-Din as heir to the throne. This succession crisis meant that the one commander Shah Muhammad trusted, his son Jalal al-Din, was the one heir his mother and the Turkic nobility opposed. The mathematical brilliance Jalal al-Din would demonstrate on battlefields, the tactical innovations chroniclers would document, the courage that would eventually earn Genghis Khan's admiration, none of it mattered to court politics. He was the wrong son of the wrong mother when the Mongol invasion came. This internal division would prove more destructive than any enemy army. Shah Muhammad II's strategic response to the Mongol threat revealed how deeply the empire's structural problems ran. His generals wanted to meet the Mongols in open battle with the full strength of the empire's forces. Historians estimate the Khwarezmian Empire could theoretically field 400,000 troops if properly mobilized. But the Shah didn't trust his commanders enough to concentrate his armies. He feared that gathering all his forces in one place would create an opportunity for a coup. So he adopted what military historians call a quote-two strategy. He garrisoned his cities individually, spreading his forces thin across the empire. It was a decision that would doom everything he had built. But in late 1218, a trade caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar. What happened next would set in motion a catastrophe that would consume 5 million people and erase a civilization from the map. In late 1219, Genghis Khan crossed the Sir Darya River with what chroniclers would later record as a force between 75,000 and 200,000 men. Modern historians favor estimates closer to the lower end. Whatever the exact number, they represented something the Islamic world had never encountered. A professional army that operated like a single organism. The cause of war was simple and brutal. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan of 450 merchants had arrived at Otrar, a border city controlled by a governor named Inalchuk. According to all contemporary sources, the secret history of the Mongols, Juvaini's chronicles, and Muslim historians like Ibn al-Athir, Inalchuk executed the entire caravan. He acted, sources suggest, on authority from Terken Khatun, the queen mother who controlled much of the border region. Genghis Khan sent diplomats demanding justice and compensation. Shah Muhammad II rather than punishing Inalchuk or negotiating, executed the Mongol envoys. This was the match that lit the fire. What made the Mongol military machine so devastating wasn't just numbers or brutality. It was organization that bordered on the supernatural for medieval armies. The Mongols operated on a decimal system that military historians still study today. Arban units of 10, Zun of 100, Mingan of 1,000, Tumen of 10,000. Every soldier knew his place in this hierarchy. Every commander had risen through meritocratic promotion based on skill, not noble birth. This wasn't an army of feudal levies or tribal warriors. This was a professional force with unified command, coordinated tactics, and a level of discipline that made European and Islamic armies look like armed mobs. Their primary weapon, the composite bow, gave them technological dominance. Made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, these bows could send arrows accurately over 300 meters. A skilled Mongol horse archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute while galloping at full speed. Think about that arithmetic. A single tumen of 10,000 archers could put 100,000 arrows into the air every 60 seconds. Contemporary accounts describe the sky literally darkening during Mongol volleys. But the real weapon was intelligence. Genghis Khan never invaded a territory without extensive reconnaissance. Merchants, spies, defectors, all provided detailed information on the economic capacity, political stability, and geographical vulnerabilities of the Khwarezmian realm. By the time the Khan's armies crossed the Sir Darya, they knew more about the empire's weaknesses than Shah Muhammad II knew himself. The campaign that followed was systematic annihilation. In February of 1220, Bukhara fell after a siege. Juvaini, who would later visit the ruins, describes the destruction as total. The great library was burned. The population was either enslaved or massacred. The city that had been a jewel of Islamic civilization for centuries was reduced to rubble in weeks. Samarkand, the capital of the empire, fell in March of 1220. The border town of Otrar, where this all began, held out for 6 months until it fell in April. When it finally surrendered, the Mongols found Inalchuk, the governor who had executed the trade caravan. According to chronicles, they poured molten silver into his eyes and ears. Revenge served cold and precise. Meanwhile, Shah Muhammad II was fleeing. Genghis had sent 2 of his greatest generals, Jebe and Subutai, with a force of 30 to 40,000 cavalry to hunt down the Shah. They pursued him across Persia, sacking cities as they went. Tus, Qazvin, Ardabil, each fell to the pursuing force. The Shah, unable to find refuge anywhere in his crumbling empire, fled to an island in the Caspian Sea. There, in December of 1220, possibly from pleurisy, possibly from despair, he died. Contemporary sources record he was buried in the rags of a servant. The emperor, who had ruled 5 million people, died alone and abandoned. But his death didn't end the resistance. The crown passed to his eldest son, the son of a Turkmen concubine, the one general his father had trusted, the 21-year-old who would give Genghis Khan the fight of his life. Jalal ad-Dunya wa ad-Din Abul Muzaffar Manguberdi ibn Muhammad, quote 3. His Turkic name might translate, was 22 years old when he inherited the ruins of his father's empire. Born in Urgenk in 1199, he had been raised in the shadow of palace politics that said the son of a concubine should never wear the crown. His mother, Aychichek, was a Turkmen woman of low status in the rigid hierarchy of the Khwarezmian court. His grandmother, Terkin Khatun, The Kipchak princess, who commanded the loyalty of the empire's Turkic military aristocracy, had made it clear she preferred his half-brother Uzlag Shah for succession. Everything about Jalal al-Din's position screamed illegitimate heir. But chronicles record that he had something his father's other sons lacked: military talent. Jalal al-Din first appears in historical records in 1215, when he was 16 years old and his father gave him control of the southwestern provinces. 4 years later, in 1219, he demonstrated that talent in a battle that his father should have lost. When Yoshi Khan, Genghis's eldest son, engaged Shah Muhammad II's forces in a skirmish, it was Jalal al-Din's tactical acumen that saved the Shah from humiliating defeat. Genghis Khan noticed. He would remember. When Shah Muhammad II died in December of 1220, Jalal al-Din tried to claim the throne at Gurganj, the old capital. But the nobility, led by his grandmother, was hostile. They still preferred Uzlag Shah. Chronicles record that Jalal al-Din discovered a plot against his life. So he fled from his own capital with just 300 cavalry, crossing the brutal Karakum Desert to escape both the Mongols and his own family's treachery. What happened next defied every military calculation. Instead of continuing to run, instead of seeking exile somewhere beyond Mongol reach, Jalal al-Din turned and fought. With 300 men, he attacked a Mongol garrison at Nesa. 700 Mongol troops held that city. Chronicles document that Jalal al-Din's 300 cavalry defeated them. News of this victory spread. In a world where the Mongols seemed unstoppable, where every battle had ended in Mongol victory, where entire armies had disintegrated at the mere rumor of the Khan's approach, here was a commander who won. Khwarezmian veterans rallied to him. Turkic warriors saw opportunity. Afghan tribesmen sought revenge for Mongol atrocities. By summer of 1221, Jalal al-Din had reached Ghazni, his father's old provincial capital. There, something remarkable happened. All contemporary sources, Juvaini, Nasawi, Juzjani, Ibn al-Athir, agree on a number that seems almost impossible. Jalal al-Din assembled a coalition of 60 to 70,000 warriors. Think about that. The Mongol war machine had just destroyed an empire of 5 million people. Cities had been leveled. Armies had been annihilated. The legitimate emperor had died fleeing in rags. And yet, a 22-year-old illegitimate heir with no rightful claim to the throne managed to convince 60,000 men to stand and fight. The coalition was diverse. Khwarezmian veterans who had survived earlier battles, Turkic cavalry under Amin Malik, who would become Jalal al-Din's father-in-law, Afghan tribesmen led by Saif al-Din Igrak, fierce mountain fighters who knew the terrain, local warlords like Temur Malik, whose daughter Jalal al-Din married to cement the alliance. Contemporary accounts describe the morale as surprisingly high. These men had witnessed Mongol brutality firsthand. They had seen Merv destroyed, Nishapur massacred, Bukhara burned. They had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. And they had a commander who had already beaten the Mongols once. What Jalal al-Din did next would shock the Islamic world and infuriate Genghis Khan himself. September of 1221. A narrow, rock-strewn valley 50 miles north of Kabul called Parwan. Genghis Khan had sent his adopted son and chief justice, Shigi Kutuku, with a force chroniclers record at anywhere between 30 and 45,000 Mongols. Juvaini says 30,000. Juzjani claims 45,000 to crush this upstart sultan. What Shigi Kutuk found was a tactical masterclass. The valley at Parwan was everything the open steppe was not. Narrow enough to channel troops into restricted paths, rock-strewn enough to break cavalry charges, steep enough on both sides to prevent the wide-ranging flanking maneuvers that made Mongol tactics so devastating. Jalal al-Din had chosen his ground with the precision of a master. But the real innovation came from a decision that Nasawi, who was there as the Sultan's secretary, recorded with specific detail. Jalal al-Din ordered his archers to dismount. In an era when mounted archery defined battlefield superiority, when the mobility of horse archers had conquered from Korea to Poland, Jalal al-Din told his men to fight on foot. The tactical reasoning was brilliant. Mounted archers fire from moving platforms. This increases rate of fire, but decreases accuracy. Dismounted archers sacrifice mobility, but gain stability. In the confined space of Parwan Valley, where Mongol cavalry couldn't maneuver anyway, stability mattered more than speed. Jalal al-Din's archers, firing from stationary positions, could aim with precision the Mongols couldn't match. The Battle of Parwan lasted 2 days. Contemporary accounts describe it as brutal close-quarters fighting where the Mongols' usual advantages evaporated. Their cavalry couldn't charge effectively through the rock-strewn terrain. Their composite bows, normally superior, were matched by the accurate fire of Jalal al-Din's dismounted archers. Their numbers, while still significant, couldn't be brought to bear all at once in the narrow confines. On the second day, Jalal al-Din personally led the decisive charge. Nasawi's eyewitness account describes the Sultan as fighting like an angry lion, leading his men into the Mongol center. The Mongol formation shattered. What had been an organized military force became a chaotic retreat. Chronicles record that Shigi Kutuk lost over half his army. Estimates suggest around 15,000 Mongol casualties. For an army that had never known defeat in this campaign, it was a catastrophic reversal. Large numbers of Mongols were captured alive. What happened next reveals the depth of hatred the Khwarezmians felt. According to Nasawi, they executed prisoners by nailing stakes into their ears. This wasn't warfare. This was revenge. News of the defeat spread with the speed of rumor and the weight of miracle. Cities that had surrendered to the Mongols and accepted their rule suddenly rebelled. Merv rose up, with Kush Tegan Pahlawan leading a successful revolt that ousted the Mongol administration. Herat rebelled. Even Bukhara saw uprisings. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For 2 years, the Mongol advance had seemed inevitable, unstoppable, divinely ordained or demonically empowered, depending on which chronicle you read. Every battle had ended in Mongol victory. Every city that resisted had been destroyed. Every army that challenged them had been annihilated. The myth of Mongol invincibility had become a weapon as powerful as their composite bows. Jalal al-Din shattered that myth. When Genghis Khan, besieging the fortress at Bamyan, received news of the defeat, he demonstrated the strategic patience that made him Genghis. According to Rashid al-Din's Compendium of Chronicles, the Khan walked the battlefield with Shigi Kutuk and explained the tactical errors that had led to the rout. Then he mobilized the main Mongol army for pursuit. But the victory at Parwan would prove more dangerous than defeat. That night, in the glow of victory campfires, a dispute over a single white horse would destroy everything. The object that destroyed a coalition and doomed Central Asia to Mongol rule was a white horse. A single Mongolian white horse, captured during the victory at Parwan. Contemporary chronicles, Juvaini, Nasawi, Juzjani, all record what happened next, with the kind of detail that suggests disbelief even among those who witnessed it. The evening after the battle, the division of spoils began. In medieval warfare, this was always a delicate moment. Different ethnic groups, different commanders, different claims to glory, all competing for the physical rewards of victory. At Parwan, two men argued over that white horse. Amin Malik, Jalal al-Din's father-in-law and commander of the Turkic cavalry on the right wing, claimed it. Saif al-Din Igrak, leader of the Afghan tribal contingent that had been crucial to the victory, disputed the claim. The argument escalated. According to all sources, Amin Malik struck Saif al-Din Igrak with a whip. This wasn't just an insult. This was a physical assault on an allied commander in front of his men. The humiliation was public and absolute. Saif al-Din Igrak demanded that Jalal al-Din discipline Amin Malik. The Sultan refused. Think about the impossible position he was in. Amin Malik was his father-in-law, commander of the Turkic cavalry that formed the core of his military strength. Disciplining him would alienate the Turkic aristocracy. But refusing to discipline him insulted the Afghan contingent that made up nearly half his coalition. Jalal al-Din chose family over justice. He refused. That night, after reproaching the Sultan for his decision, Saif al-Din Igrak made his choice. Sources record that the Afghan contingent, Khalaj tribesmen, Afghan warriors, some Konkhli Turks, left their campfires burning and departed in the darkness. They marched away silently while the rest of the army slept, taking with them between 30 and 40,000 men. By morning, Jalal al-Din's coalition of 60 to 70,000 had been reduced to approximately 30,000. Half an army, gone by sunrise, over a horse. The strategic calculation changed instantly. Jalal al-Din had defeated 30,000 Mongols with 60,000 men. The mathematics had worked. Now he had 30,000 facing a main Mongol army that would number between 30 and 50,000, led by Genghis Khan himself. The mathematics no longer worked. The Sultan understood immediately that he couldn't face Genghis with a depleted force in open battle. His only option was retreat, to reach India, to seek asylum from the Delhi Sultanate, to rebuild with whatever forces remained. He turned his army east toward the Indus River and the promise of sanctuary beyond it. But Genghis Khan, at Bamyan, when he received news of Parwan, had already begun his response. The fortress at Bamyan had been resisting for months. During the siege, a tragedy occurred that would intensify the Khan's fury. His grandson Mutugen, son of Chagatai, was killed by a poisoned arrow from the defenders. Chronicles record that this death drove Genghis to new heights of rage. When Bamyan finally fell, he ordered the complete destruction of the fortress and the massacre of every living thing within it. The Mongols called it afterward, quote, 5. Then he turned south with the main army, not delegating to generals, not sending detachments. Genghis Khan personally led the pursuit of Jalal al-Din. 3 of his 4 sons, Chagatai, Ogadai, Tolui, rode with him. The greatest military commander in human history was hunting one 22-year-old sultan. Chronicles describe the Mongol pursuit with a specific detail that suggests genuine horror. They conducted forced marches through the Afghan mountains without stopping to cook their food for 2 days straight. This wasn't just military efficiency. This was a demonstration that the Mongol war machine could operate at a tempo no medieval army had ever sustained. Jalal al-Din, slowed by 30,000 exhausted soldiers and thousands of civilian refugees fleeing Mongol terror, moved as fast as terrain and humanity allowed. But the Mongols, unencumbered by refugees, driven by fury, pushed harder. They destroyed a Khwarezmian rearguard of 1,000 men in the mountain passes. They closed the gap with every hour. On November 23, 1221, Jalal al-Din reached the banks of the Indus River and understood with perfect clarity that he would not cross it alive. The race to the Indus was a masterclass in different types of warfare. Jalal al-Din commanded a mixed army of 30,000 troops, accompanied by thousands of civilian refugees, families fleeing the Mongol advance, merchants whose cities had been destroyed, anyone who hoped that India might offer sanctuary. Every chronicler mentions these refugees, though none gives exact numbers. They slowed the army to a crawl. Genghis Khan commanded between 30 and 50,000 cavalry. Historians favor the middle of this range. All mounted, all professional, all unencumbered by civilians. The Mongols could cover in one day what Jalal al-Din's column needed 3 to complete. The pursuit through the Afghan mountains tested both forces. For the Mongols, the terrain was unfamiliar and restrictive. These were warriors bred on the open steppes, trained to fight in spaces where cavalry could maneuver freely. The narrow mountain passes, the altitude, the cold, all of it should have favored the defenders. But Mongol discipline never wavered. They pushed through conditions that would have broken lesser armies. For Jalal al-Din, every mile brought harder decisions. When the Mongol vanguard caught up to his rearguard in a mountain defile, he had to choose: sacrifice 1,000 men to buy time, or risk the entire army in a premature battle. He chose sacrifice. Chronicles record that the 1,000-man Khwarezmian rearguard fought to the last man in those passes. They bought perhaps half a day. The Mongols destroyed them and kept coming. By the time Jalal al-Din reached the Indus in late November, the Mongol vanguard was already visible on the western horizon. The river itself offered no easy escape. Contemporary sources describe it as swift, cold, swollen with seasonal runoff. The water was deep enough, estimates suggest around 20 feet in places, to drown men in heavy armor. The current was strong enough to sweep away even strong swimmers. Jalal al-Din had reached the Indus, preparing to cross, but the Mongols had caught him before he could organize a full evacuation. He was trapped. Behind him, the largest army on earth, led by history's greatest military commander. Before him, a river that would kill as surely as Mongol arrows. Beside him, thousands of terrified refugees and 30,000 exhausted warriors who had marched hundreds of miles, fought countless skirmishes, and now faced impossible odds. The Sultan made his choice. He would fight, not because he thought he could win. The mathematics of warfare made victory impossible, but because fighting was better than drowning, better than surrender, better than ending the dynasty by fleeing across a river. He chose his ground with the same tactical intelligence he had demonstrated at Parwan. His right flank would be protected by a sharp bend in the Indus River. His left flank would be anchored against a steep mountain ridge that rose sharply from the plain. The position created a battlefield perhaps 500 meters wide. Chronicles don't give exact measurements, but they describe the constraint clearly enough for modern military historians to estimate the space. This narrow ground between water and stone would negate the Mongol advantage in numbers. They couldn't outflank him if both flanks were protected by terrain. They couldn't use their superior cavalry mobility if forced to attack through a bottleneck. It was the same principle he had used at Parwan: use geography to neutralize superior forces. But this time, Genghis Khan himself was commanding. And the great Khan had learned from Shigi Kutuk's defeat. What Jalal al-Din didn't know was that Genghis was about to order a maneuver that military historians still study 800 years later. The trap was sprung. The stage was set. At dawn on November 24th, 1221, the Battle of the Indus would begin. The battlefield Jalal al-Din chose was a strip of ground perhaps 500 meters wide. Sources don't provide exact measurements, but they describe the tactical constraint with enough clarity for historians to reconstruct the space. Pinned between two natural barriers that would define everything about to happen. On his right flank, the Indus River. Swift, cold, swollen with seasonal flow, described in contemporary accounts as roughly 20 feet deep in places. On his left, a steep mountain ridge rising sharply enough that it appeared, in the assessment of the defenders, impassable to cavalry. The weather was late November cold. While chronicles don't provide exact temperature readings, the season and altitude suggest conditions well below freezing. The Indus itself would have been painfully cold. Cold enough to kill an armored man in minutes if he fell in. Jalal al-Din's defensive formation followed sound tactical doctrine for a commander facing superior numbers. His right wing, under the command of Amin Malik and composed primarily of Turkic cavalry, would hold the riverbank. The center, which Jalal al-Din commanded personally with approximately 5,000 troops, including 700 elite bodyguards, would serve as an offensive reserve. The left wing, commanded by Temur Malik and consisting of the remaining Afghan warriors who hadn't deserted after Parwan, would anchor on the mountain ridge. The tactical logic was elegant. With both flanks protected by terrain, the Mongols couldn't execute their preferred wide-ranging envelopment. They would have to attack frontally through a relatively narrow space where numbers mattered less than cohesion and discipline. Jalal al-Din had learned from Parwan that terrain could be the great equalizer. Across perhaps 200 meters of open ground, bowshot range, the Mongol army deployed in their characteristic crescent formation. The purpose of this deployment was simple and brutal: pin the enemy against an obstacle and prevent escape. Chagatai Khan commanded the Mongol right wing, facing Jalal al-Din's left. Ogadai Khan commanded the Mongol left, facing the Khwarezmian right. And in the center, commanding the reserve, was Genghis Khan himself with his Keshig, the elite 10,000-man guard that had never been defeated in battle. The Mongol objective went beyond mere victory. Genghis Khan wanted Jalal al-Din captured or killed. This wasn't just about destroying an army. This was about eliminating the last credible leader around whom Khwarezmian resistance could coalesce. The Khan had learned from Parwan that leaving Jalal al-Din alive and free meant future rebellion. This time, there would be no escape. The night before the battle, Jalal al-Din's men had spent the darkness in formation, too close to the Mongols to risk lighting fires, too exhausted to do more than grip their weapons and wait. Across that narrow gap of ground, they could hear the Mongol army stirring, the sound of horses, the clink of armor, the voices of men preparing for a battle they expected to win, as dawn broke gray and cold over the Indus on November 24th, 1221. Both armies knew what was coming. Jalal al-Din had chosen his ground, as well as any commander in history. But terrain alone wouldn't be enough to stop what was about to happen. At dawn on November 24th, 1221, sources agree on the date, though they disagree on almost everything else about this battle. The Mongol crescent began its advance. What happened in the first 2 hours defied every calculation. The side that was supposed to be overwhelmed started winning. The initial clash began with the wings engaging simultaneously. This was standard Mongol doctrine. Pressure both flanks while keeping the center reserve uncommitted, probing for weakness before committing the main force. What wasn't standard was what happened next. On the Khwarezmian right wing, Amin Malik's Turkic cavalry met Ogadai Khan's Mongol left with unexpected ferocity. Chronicles record that the Khwarezmians didn't just hold their position. They drove back the Mongol wing. Think about what this meant. Ogadai was one of Genghis Khan's sons, commanding veteran troops who had conquered half of Asia. And they were being pushed backward by defenders fighting with their backs to a river. Giovanni's chronicle uses specific language here. The Khwarezmian right wing fought with unexpected ferocity and drove back Ogadai's force. Contemporary Muslim accounts celebrate this moment as proof that the Mongols weren't invincible. For perhaps an hour, maybe two. Chronicles don't specify the duration, only that it was significant. The Khwarezmian right wing was winning. On the opposite flank, the situation was different, but no less remarkable. Timur Malik's left wing, anchored on the mountain ridge, held its defensive position against Chagatai Khan's repeated attacks. The Mongols couldn't dislodge them from the high ground. Sources describe Chagatai feeding in new troops continuously, throwing wave after wave at the ridge position, but the Khwarezmians held. For a commander whose entire strategy depended on terrain negating numerical superiority, this was the best possible outcome. Both flanks holding, the Mongol center not yet committed, and on the right wing, actual success, pushing back one of the Khan's own sons. In the center, Jalal al-Din observed the battle from his position, commanding the reserve. Nasawi, who was present with the army and recorded events shortly after, describes the Sultan assessing the situation with the eye of a born tactical commander. The right wing was pushing Ogadai back. The left wing was holding strong. There was an opportunity here. A crack in the Mongol line. A moment when boldness might achieve what caution never could. According to Nasawi's eyewitness account, Jalal al-Din made the decision that would define the battle's climax. He would commit his center reserve, 5,000 troops, including his 700 elite bodyguards, in a direct charge at the Mongol center, where Genghis Khan commanded. If he could break through, if he could reach the great Khan himself, everything would change. The Mongol formation would collapse. Victory might actually be possible. What Jalal al-Din didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that while he was watching the flanks and preparing his charge, Genghis Khan had already solved the problem of the ridge. According to Nasawi, who was with the army and recorded events shortly after, Jalal al-Din charged _quote, _9 _. The 22-year-old Sultan personally led 700 elite bodyguards straight at the Mongol center, where Genghis Khan commanded the reserve. What followed was the kind of desperate cavalry charge that exists more often in legend than in documented history, except this one appears in multiple independent sources. The tactical reasoning was sound. Amin Malik's success on the right wing had created a potential weakness in the Mongol left. If Jalal al-Din could punch through the center while Ogadai was off balance, if he could reach Genghis Khan's headquarters and force the great Khan to commit his reserves defensively, the entire Mongol formation might collapse. It was audacious. It was desperate. And for a few terrifying minutes, it almost worked. Nasawi's account, written as an eyewitness, though obviously biased toward his employer, claims that Jalal al-Din charged the Mongol center repeatedly and reached Genghis Khan and put him to flight. This is where historians have to balance sources. Nasawi, who served Jalal al-Din and later wrote his biography, had every reason to exaggerate his patron's achievements. But Giovanni, writing for the Mongol Ilkhanate, with no reason to praise a defeated enemy, confirms that a charge occurred and that it stressed the Mongol center enough to require reinforcements. The truth probably lies between these accounts. Jalal al-Din's charge clearly reached the Mongol central positions. Multiple sources agree on this. Whether he actually came close enough to personally threaten Genghis Khan is disputed. What matters tactically is that the charge was violent enough and penetrated deep enough to force Genghis to commit his Keshig Guard to stabilize the line. Chronicles note a crucial detail about the fighting. The Mongols couldn't use their arrows effectively in the crowded melee conditions. The charge had closed distance so rapidly that both sides were fighting hand to hand. Mongol composite bows, normally their decisive advantage, became useless when you're trading saber blows at arm's length. For a brief window, the tactical equation changed. Courage and skill in close combat mattered more than technological superiority or numbers. Jalal al-Din's 700 bodyguards were the finest warriors in the Khwarezmian army. These weren't tribal levies or city garrison troops. These were professional soldiers, many of them veterans, equipped with the best armor and weapons the empire could provide. In close combat, man for man, they could match anyone. But close combat has its own brutal mathematics. Even if you're trading casualties 1 for 1, eventually the side with more men wins. And Genghis Khan had approximately 50,000 troops to Jalal al-Din's 30,000. With the Keshig Guard alone numbering 10,000 elite warriors held in reserve specifically for moments like this. The Mongol center buckled but held. Reserves rushed to plug the gap. According to Giovanni, Genghis Khan personally intervened to stabilize the line, though whether this means he physically entered combat or simply directed the deployment of reserves is unclear. What is clear is that the Mongol center absorbed the charge, took casualties, and prevented the breakthrough. For perhaps 15 minutes, chronicles don't specify the duration, only that it was intense and brief. Jalal al-Din came closer to killing Genghis Khan than anyone in the Great Khan's entire military career. The Persian sources celebrate this moment as the ultimate proof of the Sultan's courage. Even the Mongol sources acknowledge the ferocity of the assault. But while Jalal al-Din was focused on breaking through the center, while he was committed to this all-or-nothing charge, Genghis Khan had already set in motion the maneuver that would decide the battle. On the left flank, on that steep ridge the Khwarezmians thought was impassable, a Mongol general named Bela Noyan was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. While Jalal al-Din was charging the Mongol center, Genghis Khan was solving a problem. The Khwarezmian left wing, anchored on that steep mountain ridge, was holding against Chaghatay's attacks. The terrain was too restrictive. The defenders were too well positioned. The ridge appeared impassable to cavalry. So Genghis did what made him Genghis. He ordered a maneuver that military historians still teach 800 years later. He told a general named Bela Noyan to take 1 tumen, 10,000 men, and climb that impassable mountain. Think about what this order required. A tumen was a full cavalry division, typically 10,000 mounted warriors. Now they would have to dismount, scale a steep mountainside that the defenders had judged too difficult for military movement, and descend on the Khwarezmian left from the rear and from high ground. During the climb, they would be vulnerable, exposed, unable to defend themselves effectively. Men would fall, horses would be lost. And all of this depended on the ridge actually being climbable. Giovanni's chronicle and Nassawi's eyewitness account both confirm this maneuver occurred. The ridge that appeared impassable to the Khwarezmians was difficult. Sources note that the Mongols took casualties during the ascent, but not impossible. Bela Noyan's force made the climb, while Chaghatai maintained pressure on the defenders from the front, keeping their attention fixed forward while death approached from above and behind. The Mongol force successfully reached the summit. Then they descended. The tactical mathematics changed instantly and catastrophically for the Khwarezmians. Temur Malik's left wing found itself caught between Chaghatai's frontal assault and Bela Noyan's attack from the rear and high ground. being attacked from two directions simultaneously is difficult. Being attacked from two directions when one of those directions is from above, where gravity itself becomes a weapon for the enemy, is nearly impossible to defend against. The left wing collapsed. Chronicles use that specific word. Collapsed, not retreated, not fell back. Collapsed, meaning the unit ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. Soldiers broke and ran. Formations disintegrated. Command structure evaporated. Timur Malik, the commander of the left wing, was killed in the melee. Sources confirm his death, but don't provide detailed circumstances. He died fighting, presumably trying to rally his men or cover their retreat. With the left wing destroyed, the Mongol cavalry poured through the gap into the Khwarezmian rear. Everything Jalal al-Din had built his defensive strategy on. The anchored flanks, the terrain advantage, the narrow killing ground. All of it evaporated in minutes. The ridge he had thought would protect his left had become the avenue of his destruction. This was the turning point, the moment when tactical brilliance on one side met tactical innovation on the other, and innovation won. Jalal al-Din had chosen his ground as well as any commander could. He had used terrain to negate numerical superiority. He had positioned his forces with textbook precision. And none of it mattered because Genghis Khan had been willing to risk 10,000 men on a climb that looked impossible. Modern military analysis of the battle focuses on this maneuver as a demonstration of Mongol adaptability. These weren't just steppe cavalry tactics. This was mountain warfare capability. This was combined arms thinking, Chagatai holding the front while Bela Noyan climbed. That showed why the Mongols conquered diverse terrain, from deserts to forests to river valleys. The defensive line Jalal al-Din had anchored on terrain shattered. And now Mongol cavalry were attacking his center from the rear, while he was still committed to his forward charge. The tactical situation had reversed completely. By what? Chronicles describe as _quote_12_, the only specific time marker most sources provide. The Battle of the Indus had stopped being a battle. It had become a massacre. Jalal al-Din's defensive line no longer existed. His left wing was destroyed. His center was surrounded, and the Mongols were doing what the Mongols did best: systematic annihilation. The Khwarezmian formation broke into isolated groups, each cut off from the others, each surrounded by Mongol cavalry. This is when the true horror of medieval warfare manifested. When formations break and men scatter. When command structure collapses and every soldier fights alone, casualties mount exponentially. Chronicles describe the scene with terms like slaughter, massacre, and few escaped. The language of catastrophe. The Mongol crescent formation, which had pinned the Khwarezmians against the river from the start, now closed completely. Soldiers who tried to retreat found themselves driven toward the Indus. Men in heavy armor faced an impossible choice: stand and fight until exhausted, then die, or try to cross a swift, freezing river in 40 pounds of metal. Many chose the river. Most of those drowned. Contemporary accounts describe the Indus claiming men in armor like the river itself was fighting for the Mongols. The current was too strong, the weight too much, the water too cold. Bodies would wash downstream for days. Among the trapped soldiers were thousands of civilians, the refugees who had accompanied Jalal al-Din's army, hoping to find sanctuary in India. Chronicles record that these non-combatants were _16_. This was standard Mongol policy in rebellious territories. Total war that left no survivors who might harbor future resistance. The exact casualty figures are unknown. Medieval chroniclers rarely kept accurate counts. and modern historians can only estimate based on the qualitative descriptions in sources. What we know is this: Jalal al-Din started the battle with approximately 20 to 30,000 troops. By the end of the day, perhaps 4,000 would escape across the Indus. That means the majority of the Khwarezmian army died on the western bank. Mongol casualties went unrecorded. This is typical. Victors in medieval battles rarely documented their own losses. We can infer they were lower than Khwarezmian casualties because they won, and because their tactical position surrounding the enemy typically meant fewer losses. But we have no numbers. History has not preserved that information. In the chaos of systematic slaughter, Jalal al-Din was still fighting. Multiple sources confirm this. Nasawi describes him continuing to lead charges even as his army disintegrated around him. The Sultan accumulated wounds. Sources disagree on how many, with some claiming as many as 17, though this specific number cannot be verified, but kept fighting until someone he trusted finally told him the truth. His army was gone, his family was dead, or about to be, and if he didn't leave now, the dynasty would end here. What Jalal al-Din did next would echo through history for 800 years. What happened next appears in multiple independent sources: Persian, Mongol, and even Georgian chronicles written by people who hated Jalal al-Din. This convergence of hostile sources on the same basic narrative is why historians treat this moment as verified history, not legend. Though what Jalal al-Din did was so improbable that legend is what it became. Chronicles don't specify who convinced Jalal al-Din to abandon the field. Nasawi implies it was his cousin Akash Malik who urged him to save himself, quote, 17. The logic was brutal, but sound. The army was destroyed. The battle was lost. But if Jalal al-Din died here, the Khwarezmian line would end completely. If he escaped, the possibility of resistance remained alive. Jalal al-Din made his decision. He would break out. What followed was a suicidal charge through Mongol lines toward the cliff edge overlooking the Indus. According to multiple sources, Jalal al-Din led this final assault personally, fighting his way through the encirclement to reach the precipice. The cliff was approximately 20 feet high. Sources provide this detail with enough consistency that historians accept it. Overlooking rapids. At the cliff edge, chronicles record that Jalal al-Din shed his heavy armor. Plate and mail that had protected him through the battle would become an anchor in water. He shed his royal insignia, the symbols of authority that would identify him as high-value target. Then he spurred his horse forward. Horse and rider plunged off the 20-foot cliff into the Indus River. The impact would have been brutal. The water, cold enough to shock the system, swift enough to sweep away a strong swimmer, deep enough to swallow them both. Mongol archers on the bank fired at the swimming figure. This is where the story becomes testimony to something beyond tactics. Genghis Khan, witnessing the leap from his position on the western bank, did something unprecedented. According to Rashid al-Din's Compendium of Chronicles, corroborated by Juvaini and even referenced in Georgian sources, the great Khan struck his hand to his mouth in astonishment. A specific gesture that multiple independent sources record, and ordered his archers to stop shooting. The order rang out, "Stop shooting! Do not shoot!" The arrows ceased. Jalal al-Din, still in the river, still swimming despite the current and the cold, was allowed to reach the far bank. Rashid al-Din includes a detail that other sources don't. Upon reaching the opposite shore, Jalal al-Din cleaned his sword in the water, a gesture of defiance or ritual, the significance of which remains debated. Then came the words that would outlive empires. Genghis Khan turned to his sons, Chagatai, Ogaday, and Tolui were all present, sources confirm, and spoke. The exact wording varies between chronicles, but the sentiment is identical across all sources. Rashid al-Din provides the longest version, quote, 19. Other sources give shorter versions, quote, 20. Some records have Genghis instructing his sons to learn from Jalal al-Din's example. The convergence of hostile sources on this moment is historically remarkable. The Mongols had no reason to record admiration for a defeated enemy. The Georgians had no reason to celebrate a man who would later invade their kingdom. The Persians were documenting their own catastrophic defeat. Yet all of them preserved this story because it transcended the politics of the moment. Genghis Khan had watched his armies destroy half the known world. He had seen courage and cowardice, brilliance and stupidity, victory and defeat. But in that moment, watching a 22-year-old Sultan refuse to surrender even when everything was lost, the great Khan recognized something that existed outside the usual calculations of conquest. Will itself made visible. The battle was over. The army was destroyed. But the legend had just begun. What the afternoon revealed, chronicles don't wait for morning in this case, was the mathematics of defeat written in bodies. Sources don't provide exact counts. Medieval chroniclers rarely did. But they use language that leaves no doubt about scale. Slaughter, massacre, few escaped, most killed. Jalal al-Din had entered the battle with approximately 20 to 30,000 troops. Perhaps 4,000 managed to cross the Indus with him, either during the battle or in the chaotic aftermath. That means the majority of the Khwarezmian army, historians estimate between 70 and 85%, died on the western bank. Some fell in combat. Some drowned trying to cross the river in armor. Some were executed after surrender. The refugee casualties are even harder to quantify because sources don't provide numbers for how many civilians accompanied the army. Chronicles mention, quote, 25 of refugees, but offer no precision. What they do document is that these non-combatants were systematically killed. This was Mongol policy in rebellious territories. Eliminate everyone who might carry the spark of future resistance. Then came the family executions. Genghis Khan's standard practice with rival dynasties was total elimination of the male line. Jalal al-Din's 7-year-old son was executed. His infant was executed. All male relatives who fell into Mongol hands were killed. Sources confirm these deaths. The fate of Jalal al-Din's harem is disputed between chronicles. Some sources claim the women were killed or distributed as war spoils. Others suggest that Jalal al-Din himself ordered them drowned in the Indus before his own escape, choosing death over the dishonor of captivity. The historical record doesn't provide enough clarity to determine which account is accurate. The Khwarezmian camp was overrun. The royal treasury, according to chronicles, was thrown into the Indus during the chaos. Genghis Khan spent several days camped at the river and ordered divers to search for it. Whether they recovered anything, sources don't record. The military standards and royal regalia were lost. Mongol casualties remain unknown. No source records them. This is typical for medieval battles. Victors rarely documented their own losses with the same detail they applied to enemy casualties. We can infer they were lower than Khwarezmian losses because the Mongols won and because their tactical position, surrounding the enemy, attacking from multiple directions, typically meant fewer casualties. But we have no numbers. What we do know is that Bela Noyan's climbing force took casualties during the ascent of the ridge. We know that Jalal al-Din's center charge into the Mongol reserves caused fighting intense enough to require Genghis's personal intervention. But none of this gives us figures. Genghis Khan spent the next several days at the Indus. He ordered the search for treasure, he executed prisoners, and according to some sources, he used the battlefield as a classroom, teaching his sons military lessons using the recently concluded battle as illustration. The great Khan was always thinking about succession, about ensuring his sons could lead armies after his death. Then he made a decision that would spare India the fate of Central Asia, at least for now. He would not cross the Indus in force. The pursuit was over. Jalal al-Din had escaped, but his army was destroyed, his family dead, his empire gone. The strategic objective had been achieved, but the consequences were just beginning. In early 1222, sources place this weeks after the Indus battle, Genghis Khan sent 2 Tumans into India, 20,000 cavalry under commanders Dorbay Dakshin, called __quote_26 and Bala. Their mission: hunt down Jalal al-Din and finish what the Indus had started. What they discovered was that India in summer could defeat the Mongols in ways no army had managed. The pursuit force crossed the Indus into the Punjab region. Their first target was Nandana Fort, held by one of Jalal al-Din's lieutenants. Chronicles record that the Mongols captured the fort and massacred the garrison, standard Mongol practice for resistance. Then they advanced toward Multan, a larger and more important city. The siege of Multan would demonstrate the Mongol limitations. For 42 days, 20,000 Mongol cavalry besieged the city. They managed to breach the wall through their typical combination of siege engineering and relentless assault. But the Khwarezmian defenders, now fighting with their backs truly against the wall and no possibility of retreat, held the city despite the breach. The heat became unbearable. This was summer in the Punjab, temperatures that could exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The Mongols, bred on the steppes and mountains of Central Asia, accustomed to continental climates with cold winters and moderate summers, found the subtropical heat intolerable. After 42 days of siege, with casualties mounting from heat exhaustion more than combat, the Mongols withdrew. This withdrawal marked the end of Mongol pursuit into India. They had crossed the Indus. They had captured one fort. They had besieged one city. And the climate had defeated them where armies could not. Meanwhile, Jalal al-Din was attempting diplomacy. With approximately 4,000 survivors from the Indus battle, he approached Sultan Iltutmish of the Delhi Sultanate. The request was straightforward: asylum and military alliance against the Mongols. The logic seemed sound. The Mongols threatened India as much as they had threatened Khwarezm. Why not unite against common enemy? Iltutmish, however, was no fool. He understood that harboring Jalal al-Din would invite the full weight of the Mongol Empire onto India. The decision he made would save the Delhi Sultanate from the fate that had befallen Central Asia. He refused. The refusal was diplomatic rather than hostile. Iltutmish gave gifts. He married one of his daughters to Jalal al-Din as a peace offering. But he made clear that the Sultan would find no military alliance, no sanctuary within Delhi territory. Jalal al-Din would have to move south into Sindh, away from Delhi's borders. This decision by Iltutmish represents one of the most consequential acts of medieval statesmanship. By refusing to support Jalal al-Din, by maintaining neutrality with the Mongol Empire, the Delhi Sultan ensured that India would not be conquered the way Central Asia had been. The Mongol invasions of India would come later, would be smaller in scale, and would never achieve the total conquest that befell Khwarezm. There's an intriguing footnote to the pursuit. Historian Peter Jackson has suggested that Dorbay Dakshin the fierce commander of the pursuit force, may have converted to Islam and joined Jalal al-Din rather than return to face Genghis Khan's wrath for failing to capture the Sultan. The theory is speculative, but based on the historical record showing that Dorbay simply disappears from Mongol sources after the India expedition. Genghis had instructed his commanders not to return unsuccessfully. Perhaps Dorbay, faced with the choice between admitting failure and defection, chose the latter. Jalal al-Din would spend 3 years in India, raiding, fighting local princes, building a small warband from the 4,000 who had crossed the Indus with him. And then, in 1224, he would do what everyone thought was impossible. He would return to Persia and try to rebuild his father's empire. The Battle of the Indus wasn't just the end of Jalal al-Din's army. It was the end of the Khwarezmian Empire itself. Within months, the cities that had rebelled after Parwan, inspired by the Sultan's victory, would be systematically annihilated in a campaign of retribution that chroniclers describe as apocalyptic. Merv, Nishapur, Herat, the cities that had risen in rebellion after news of Parwan spread, now faced Mongol vengeance. The destruction was methodical and total. Juvayni's chronicle, written decades later after he had personally visited the ruins, describes Merv's fate with language that still shocks. The massacre was so complete that _28_ contemporary accounts record that in November of 1221, Shigi Kutuk ordered an additional 100,000 killed at Merv. This number is almost certainly exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers often inflated casualty figures. But the scale of destruction was real enough that even accounting for exaggeration, the death toll was catastrophic. Nishapur faced similar annihilation. The city was destroyed and its population massacred. Herat, which had initially surrendered and been spared during the first Mongol advance, was now punished for its rebellion. The pattern was consistent. Cities that had dared to rise up after Parwan were made examples. The message was clear. Resistance, even temporary successful resistance, like Jalal al-Din's victory, would be punished with total destruction. Modern historians describe this as a demographic catastrophe. The urban civilization of Central Asia, which had flourished for over 1,000 years, was disrupted so fundamentally that it took centuries to recover. Some cities never fully rebuilt. The population of the region collapsed. The irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for generations were destroyed. Trade routes that had connected China to the Mediterranean for millennia were abandoned. Historian Michal Biran has noted that the speed with which the Mongols brought the pragmatically brutal warfare of East Asia into the less ruthless Muslim world was itself a factor in the cultural shock. The Islamic world had never experienced systematic annihilation on this scale, conducted with this level of efficiency. The territorial changes were permanent. The Khwarezmian Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. Its territory, Transoxiana, Khorasan, the lands between the Amudarya and Sir Darya rivers, was absorbed into the Mongol Empire. The Indus River became the temporary eastern boundary of Mongol expansion. The Golden Horde would later rule the region for centuries. The Delhi Sultanate, having wisely refused to support Jalal al-Din, survived. India was spared the total conquest that befell Central Asia. Future Mongol raids would come, would cause damage, would extract tribute. But India would never experience the systematic destruction that erased Merv and Nishapur from significance. After the Indus, Genghis Khan turned westward. He had achieved his strategic objective, the complete destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire and the elimination of Jalal al-Din as an organized threat. The Khan returned to Mongolia, turned his attention to other campaigns, other conquests. His final military expedition would be against the Western Xia Kingdom in 1226 to 1227. On August 18, 1227, Genghis Khan died during that campaign. He was approximately 60 to 65 years old. The cause of death is disputed. Some sources suggest injuries, others illness. But the great Khan, who had witnessed Jalal al-Din's leap and forbidden his archers to shoot, died having conquered more territory than any other individual in human history. The Mongol Empire would continue to expand after his death. His sons and grandsons would conquer more territory, would establish dynasties from China to Eastern Europe. But the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, concluded at the Indus River, would remain one of the most complete and devastating campaigns in the entire Mongol military record. By 1222, Central Asia belonged to the Mongols. The empire that had ruled 5 million people existed only in memory, and the 22-year-old Sultan, who had leaped into the Indus, was wandering the Punjab with 4,000 desperate men, planning his next impossible campaign. Jalal al-Din didn't die at the Indus. That would have been cleaner. Instead, he lived another 10 years. 10 years of fighting, winning, losing, rebuilding, and ultimately proving that even extraordinary military talent means nothing without political wisdom. The 22-year-old who had leapt into the Indus would die at 32, alone in the mountains. Murdered not by Mongols, but by a Kurdish assassin who may have been seeking revenge or may have just wanted the bounty. The 3 years in India, from 1221 to 1224, were spent raiding and fighting local princes, with approximately 4,000 survivors from the Indus. Jalal al-Din defeated several opponents and conquered parts of Punjab and Sindh. He was building a new warband from nothing, demonstrating the same military skill that had won Parwan and nearly broken through at the Indus. But Sultan Iltutmish of Delhi, having refused military alliance, continued to maintain pressure. The diplomatic marriage, the gifts, the courtesies, all of these came with an implicit message: move away from Delhi's borders. Jalal al-Din raided Sindh and northern Gujarat, plundering what he couldn't rule, building resources for his eventual return. In 1224, Jalal al-Din returned to Persia at the request of his brother Ghiyath al-Din Pir Shah, who still controlled parts of the region. The Sultan began systematically rebuilding his father's empire. In 1224, he confirmed vassals in Kerman. In 1225, he captured Azerbaijan and made Tabriz his capital on July 25th. In 1226, he invaded Georgia and sacked Tbilisi in March. For a few years, it seemed possible. Jalal al-Din controlled Kerman, Tabriz, Isfahan, Fars, substantial territories that could form the foundation of a new kingdom. He had proven he could still fight and win. In 1227, the Mongols reappeared. A force entered central Persia, and Jalal al-Din fought them near Isfahan. The battle's outcome is disputed between sources. Some record it as a Mongol victory. Others suggest the Mongol losses were so severe that they withdrew from Persia back to Transoxiana, despite technically winning the field. What matters is that Jalal al-Din had demonstrated he could still fight the Mongols effectively. But he couldn't build alliances. He couldn't maintain peace with his neighbors. He couldn't consolidate power politically. Contemporary assessments, even from Nasawi, who served him and admired his military prowess, acknowledged that Jalal al-Din was a terrible ruler. Historian Vasily Bartold would later write that Jalal al-Din, quote, 29. The Sultan made enemies of potential allies, fought wars on multiple fronts, and isolated himself against the Mongol threat. In 1230, the isolation became fatal. A combined force of the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, Kaikubad I, and the Ayyubid ruler defeated Jalal al-Din at the Battle of Yasikmen, also called Erzincan, on August 10th. This was his first significant defeat since returning from India. It ended his westward expansion and demonstrated that his Muslim neighbors feared him as much as they feared the Mongols. In 1231, a new Mongol army under the general Shorma Khan invaded northern Iran. This force numbered between 30 and 50,000 men. Jalal al-Din, unable to recruit a sufficient army to face them, fled to the mountains of Kurdistan. There, in August of 1231, he was killed by a Kurdish assassin. The circumstances remain mysterious. Some sources suggest it was revenge for past atrocities Jalal al-Din's forces had committed. Others imply someone was collecting a bounty. The Khwarezmian dynasty ended not in a climactic battle, but in a remote mountain village with a knife in the dark. He was 32 years old. He had spent exactly half his life fighting the Mongols. He had won impossible victories and survived impossible odds. He had made Genghis Khan admire him. But he couldn't survive himself. Couldn't overcome his own political failures. Couldn't build the alliances that might have sustained resistance. His army survived him. The Khwarezmiya, as his soldiers were called, fought as mercenaries across the Levant until their final defeat in 1246. But Jalal al-Din himself died the way he had lived since the Indus, fighting, moving, refusing to submit, and ultimately isolated by his own inability to build anything lasting. 800 years later, the Battle of the Indus remains one of the few medieval battles where both sides' chronicles tell essentially the same story. Persian sources celebrate Jalal al-Din's courage. Mongol sources, including the secret history written for Mongol eyes only, record Genghis Khan's admiration. Even Georgian chronicles, written by people who had suffered Jalal al-Din's invasion of their homeland, confirm the Sultan's extraordinary valor. When enemies agree on a story, historians pay attention. This cross-cultural consensus is historically remarkable. Medieval chronicles were propaganda instruments as much as historical records. Authors writing for Muslim courts had every incentive to exaggerate their heroes' achievements and minimize defeats. Mongol chroniclers had every reason to downplay any moment of weakness or admiration for enemies. Georgian historians had no love for a man who had sacked Tbilisi. Yet Juvayni, writing his history of the world conqueror while serving the Mongol Ilkhanate, provides a balanced account that praises Jalal al-Din's courage while acknowledging his political failures. Nasawi, who served as Jalal al-Din's secretary and wrote the most detailed account, admits his patron's brutal treatment of subjects, even while celebrating his military genius. Rashid al-Din's Compendium of Chronicles, written under Mongol patronage, preserves Genghis Khan's quote about such a son without embarrassment or qualification. The convergence suggests something transcended the usual political calculations. The leap into the Indus and Genghis's response represented a moment of pure human drama that forced even hostile witnesses to record it honestly. Modern historians analyze the battle for different reasons. Military scholars study Bela Noyan's ridge climb as an example of tactical innovation. The willingness to risk 10,000 men on a maneuver that looked impossible but proved decisive. The battle demonstrates how terrain can be both advantage and trap. How defensive positions that appear impregnable can be outflanked by commanders willing to attempt the impossible. Scholars of asymmetric warfare examine what happens when a numerically inferior force refuses to be intimidated, Jalal al-Din's victories at Parwan and his near breakthrough at the Indus show that superior numbers and technology don't guarantee victory when facing determined, tactically brilliant resistance. The lessons apply beyond medieval cavalry warfare. But the battle's deeper legacy is about memory itself. Different nations have claimed different aspects of the story for their own nationalist narratives. Iranian historians have framed Jalal al-Din as fighting for Persian independence, though in reality, he was fighting for personal survival. Turkish writers, particularly 19th century author Namık Kemal, have made him a Turkish national hero. Uzbekistan erected a monument to him in Urgench, his birthplace. Each interpretation serves contemporary political purposes, but all draw from the same verified historical core. The enduring question is why this battle matters. Tactically, it demonstrated Mongol adaptability in restrictive terrain. These weren't just steppe warriors, but soldiers who could fight in mountains, forests, rivers. Psychologically, it showed the limits of intimidation against determined resistance. Genghis Khan's quote reveals something profound. Even the greatest military commander in history recognized that some things, individual courage, absolute refusal to surrender, transcend political and military calculations. The Mongols won the war. They conquered half the known world. They created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But 800 years later, what do we actually remember from the Indus? Not the strategic inevitability, not even the tactical brilliance of Bela Noyan's climb, though military historians still study it. We remember a 22-year-old spurring his horse off a cliff into a freezing river. We remember a 60-year-old conqueror forbidding his archers to shoot. We remember 6 words bridging the chasm between enemy commanders. Such a son should a father have. The battle teaches something that transcends medieval warfare. It demonstrates that there are forms of victory that exist outside conventional metrics of success. Jalal al-Din didn't save his empire, didn't protect his family, didn't even save his army. But he did something arguably more difficult. He made the most feared military commander in human history pause and reflect. That moment of recognition, documented in Persian, Mongol, and Georgian sources, tells us something about human nature. Courage, at its absolute limit, creates a kind of gravity that even enemies can't resist. The leap and the words spoken afterward survived because they touch something universal. The human capacity for courage in the face of certain defeat, and the equally human capacity to recognize nobility even in an enemy. Somewhere in the mountains of Pakistan, the Indus River still flows. The exact spot where Jalal al-Din made his leap is unknown. The river has changed course over 8 centuries. The landscape has evolved. The specific cliff cannot be located. No monument marks the battlefield. No archaeological evidence remains. But the story persists because it doesn't need physical monuments. It's carved into cultural memory across 3 civilizations. The legend outlived the empire. The numbers tell one story. The Mongol Empire would eventually control 24 million square kilometers, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The Khwarezmian Empire ceased to exist. Central Asia would take centuries to recover from the demographic catastrophe. Genghis Khan's descendants would rule from Korea to Hungary. Jalal al-Din would die hunted and alone, murdered in a Kurdish village at age 32. By every measure of political and military success, the Battle of the Indus was a footnote to inevitable Mongol conquest. And yet, 800 years later, what do we actually remember? Not the strategic inevitability, not the casualty ratios, not even the tactical brilliance of Belanoyan's ridge climb, though military historians still study it. We remember a 22-year-old Sultan spurring his horse off a 20-foot cliff into a freezing river. We remember a 60-year-old conqueror who had ordered the execution of entire cities, forbidding his archers to shoot. We remember 6 words that bridged the chasm between enemy commanders. Such a son should a father have. The Battle of the Indus teaches something that transcends medieval warfare. It demonstrates that there are forms of victory that exist outside conventional metrics of success. Jalal al-Din didn't save his empire, didn't protect his family, didn't even save his army. But he did something arguably more difficult. He made the most feared military commander in human history pause and reflect. That moment of recognition, recorded in Persian, Mongol, and Georgian sources, tells us something profound about human nature. Courage at its absolute limit creates a kind of gravity that even enemies can't resist. Military historians analyze the Indus for its tactical lessons, how terrain can negate technological advantages, how flanking maneuvers can shatter defensive lines, how individual leadership can extend resistance beyond reasonable expectations. But the battle's deeper lesson is about what we choose to remember and why. The Mongol Empire dissolved centuries ago. The Khwarezmian Empire is forgotten outside specialist circles. But the image of that leap, and the words spoken afterward, survived because they touched something universal: the human capacity for courage in the face of certain defeat, and the equally human capacity to recognize nobility even in an enemy. Somewhere in the mountains of Pakistan, the Indus River still flows. The exact spot where Jalal al-Din made his leap is unknown. The river has changed course over 8 centuries. No monument marks the battlefield. No archaeological evidence remains. But the story persists because it doesn't need physical monuments. It's carved into cultural memory across 3 civilizations. Persian poets celebrated it. Mongol chroniclers preserved it. Georgian historians confirmed it. Modern scholars analyze it. And all because, on one frozen afternoon in November of 1221, 2 men, one young, one old, one desperate, one triumphant, created a moment that transcended their immediate circumstances. The Battle of the Indus reminds us that history judges us not just by our victories or defeats, but by how we face the impossible. Jalal al-Din faced it with a leap. Genghis Khan faced it with magnanimity. And 800 years later, we're still talking about it. That's not a footnote to conquest. That's immortality of a different kind. The kind you earn not by winning, but by refusing to surrender who you are, even when everything else is lost.